Hey, everybody, welcome again to eChannel News. We've got Robin Odie, he's the principal analyst, and of course, from Omdia. And we're going to be talking MSP predictions and what's going on. I mean, obviously, these guys are digging into what's going on in the MSP world from a data perspective. And hell, we'd like to gel that and see how it's matching with what we see in the front lines. Robin, welcome. How are you doing?
I'm doing well, thanks, man. Yeah, I mean, there's huge amounts going on. Looking forward to digging into it. I mean, I imagine that we're hearing a lot of the same things, and it'll be interesting to see what you're seeing in particular from some of the areas where you think MSPs are adding value.
Yeah, look, man, this is like one of the, let's say this is one of our most exciting type of discussions because we hear so much stuff about this, but you guys are digging into data. Let's start by what you think. What's surprising right now in what you've found so far? Is there any one, two, three things that is surprising?
Um, well, I suppose surprising. Well, it's a good point. Surprising maybe, but more perhaps just how much things are taking to transition. So let me just to be a bit sort of, I guess, a bit clearer. One of the sort of main things that we hear, obviously, and MSPs will be familiar with this, is the sort of transition of MSPs generally is taking a bit longer than people expected in terms of the ability to add resources and capabilities to manage the kind of high value technologies and services which customers now sort of require. And I won't say it's table stakes, it's not, because that assumes that all customers expect all bells and whistles from their managed services, which they don't. But for those that do, the difficulty in ramping up capability around things like compliance, around things like, GRC and CISO and virtual CISO and things like that, along with all the new technologies that people are getting bombarded with, and then you've got to throw in AI and how you've got to automate everything in your business. I mean, it's incredibly complex for most MSPs to get their head around, and even the largest resellers and service providers in the world can't get their heads around this stuff. It's incredibly hard to deal with. So getting swamped in all of that stuff is more the way I would say it's not surprising, but it's just unfortunate the fact that MSPs who are trying to do their best, trying to work very hard for their customers, still just, struggling to get a narrative on exactly what they should be doing, how they should be doing it, how they should be going to market with their customers. The best ones are the ones we always highlight, right? And when we look at those ones, we think everything's fine. MSP is going to be great.
Right.
But actually, we know that as far as we can see, MSP has been growing sort of double digit for years. And in some cases, some MSPs growing faster than that. But now we're starting to see a little bit of doubt creep into those double digits. And we had originally predicted about 10% on the best end, best case scenario for growth for this year, and probably 6% more like in some places and for some partners. And what that really means is that growth is therefore not really, when you count it organically, isn't really growth. Because there's some price rises, there's some acquisition related growth and so on. And so 6% isn't really growth in the MSP space. You start getting up to 10, 12, 15, that's real accretive growth. And the difficulty is there's just not enough seat addition to this area. People aren't adding enough seats, not adding enough new customers. And that's just unfortunately true. We've seen a lot of kind of customer churn in the MSP space. So essentially, to answer the question, I think the thing that's most surprising is that we would hope that these things kind of get solved, I guess, or that there's some better horizon for MSPs. But it looks like things are going to be a bit difficult right now for everyone to find growth.
Yeah, I mean, some MSPs tell us, man, I didn't sign up for this, man. I got to do compliance
Yeah,
now. I got to
yeah,
do
yeah,
cybersecurity. And
yeah,
apparently, if I screw up, the lawyer is going to be knocking on my doors. And
yeah,
this game, right? These MSPs have got a big target on their back, right? So
yeah,
when they get hit, a whackload of their customers could potentially be at risk. So they're like, their risk factor is not even just growth anymore, right? It's like, can I stay in business if I get hit? Am
mm,
I doing the right thing for my clients? And then, of course, while things were kind of like getting kind of cool, AI comes along and adds this layer of complexities.
yeah,
And you've got the Wild West happening in AI. And then these MSPs going, whoa, 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 whoa,
Yeah.
we're not even there yet, right? Are you
Yeah.
finding that, I don't know, I don't want to say frustration, but that
Mm.
very complex mindset of like, wow, is this what it means to be an MSP today?
Yes, I mean the thing about particularly about the when I talk about the best MSPs earlier, I think the best companies generally, certainly the best channel partners, and in the MSP space is no different, is the ones that don't kind of lose their heads when it comes to things like AI. There is no amount, there is no short amount of money to be made in shouting at people that they're falling behind and they're behind the curve and they have to speed up and fine, but that doesn't really help anyone. Now, what we have seen in the MSP space, which has always been kind of one of the great things about it, is it's incredibly collaborative. People share information, they provide what's really going on. It's one of the reasons why being an analyst in the MSP space is tricky because it's assuming that you're going to teach an MSP about how to run an MSP is a ridiculous thing to do. What you're really supposed to be doing is aggregating what MSPs are talking about and then providing that back out into the market so that everyone can see what's really going on. And that's the best you can do. And honestly, I think that's the best anyone should hope to do. So from MSP's perspective around AI, what we have seen is a huge number of small startup software companies talking to small individual MSPs and asking them for the ability to essentially go in and use the data on ticketing and things like that to help drive a AI service desk model. So small SaaS companies going in, talking to MSPs, asking MSPs, hey, can you be a guinea pig for this SaaS that we're building, this AI service desk tool? And we're working with 5 or 10 others. And we're essentially what we're going to try and do is create a sort of probabilistic model for AI that helps to automate ticketing, triage, and even response and remediation on some tickets. And that has a benefit for everyone. But that is essentially a lot of that is going on under the surface. And I think where that's helpful is it's actually a relatively small, not simple, but at least approachable version of how we use AI in our business to have a real return on investment. And one of the most important returns on those investments is actually trying to lower the amount of technician time. And the best MSPs that we see aren't using AI to replace headcount. What they're using is using AI to actually give their employees, certainly some of the sort of L1, L2 techs that are kind of swamped with tickets, to hopefully get to a point where they have a little bit more time to not be swamped with those tickets. And what that should mean is actually better employee retention scores in the MSP space, which up until recently have been incredibly hard to try to retain employees because it's such a high burnout industry. So one of the best things that I see about AI in the MSP space is if you can gather a kind of approachable, small, easy use case around things like ticketing, which we have seen a lot, the benefit to that is not necessarily sort of millions of dollars in revenue and suddenly selling this to all your customers. That may be down the road, and some people are looking at. It's actually how you actually just improve the life internally of the MSP, improve the culture of the MSP, improve the employee sense and experience at the MSP, because that has a direct impact on customer retention, on customer happiness too, and customer satisfaction.
Yeah, I mean, the mental health of these people is honestly, man, I think it's a
Yeah.
personally, I think it's one of the hardest jobs on the planet.
Yeah.
It's like they never get a break. I mean, and the worst things always happen at five
Yeah.
o'clock on Fridays and the weekends and
Mhm.
Sundays and holidays and Super Bowls and everything else because, obviously the bad actors know when people are hanging out, right?
Yeah.
So it's kind of a relentless, constant, challenge. One of the challenges that we found with MSPs is that they're saying, you know what? Yeah, we want to get new customers,
Mhm.
but man, it's getting kind of harder to keep
Yeah.
and retain current customers. There's like a
Yeah.
lot of people going in there saying they could do this and that. There's a lot of
Mhm.
automation happening, et cetera, et cetera. What are you finding in terms of balancing between customer acquisition and retention?
So it's interesting. We did a poll last year, and we were essentially asking MSPs how many of their customers came from a previous MSP, and how many of them were essentially greenfield customers that had never worked with an MSP before. Now, may be unsurprising to people, but about 70% of customers were coming from another MSP, which is essentially churning one customer to another customer. Um, and only 30% were kind of new companies or companies that hadn't had an MSP, or maybe they had some IT sort of help person, but not a formal relationship. And really, at the acquisition stage of new companies, you're generally dealing with smaller companies. At the mid-market, you're usually dealing with companies that have already had some version of managed service already internally. And so there, the number of existing customers to greenfield customers is obviously going to be much lower of a ratio, much higher a ratio in that sector. So for those smaller MSPs that are sort of struggling with retention, one of the most difficult things is, of course, in demonstrating your capability on an ongoing basis. Now, if you are, to some degree, oddly, automation actually makes this harder because if you automate more of your business, a bit like something that you just expect to always work. If it always works, you think, well, what's it really doing? Right. And so that's where often we'd heard MSPs talking about having to do kind of QBRs with their customers, really set with make sure that everyone knew exactly what you were doing, what threats you'd stopped, etc. And a lot people would think coming up with lots of different ways to demonstrate value. This is what we do for you on an annual basis. This is why the MSP down the road isn't necessarily going to do the same thing for you, is the kind of hidden message. The difficulty is, of course, that takes up time and resource. And so one of the areas of automation that people wanted to come up with was how you do reporting to customers on how you provide that value. And so things like automation around your documentation tools to be able to take out documentation from customers, automate a report, send it out to your customers and say, this is what we did, this is how we keep you compliant and so on. But again, in the smaller business space, these things are kind of relatively hard. And so one of the most sort of important things is if you can, and this is kind of crazy, but if you can, is try not to take on so many customers that the new customers that you take on aren't really you can't really take the time to show them the value you provide them. I mean, I know MSPs that are turning business away. They're relatively small companies, they're one, two, maybe $3 million in size, but they have a careful, slow, steady growth trajectory because that is how they're going to have to add people, more customer managers, more customer experience and kind of customer satisfaction roles. And those kinds of roles take time to bring and get them up to speed and understand what's going on. You can't scale MSPs at that size without going through high customer churn levels. And most MSPs of that size don't really want to go through that. And there's no real reason why they should go through that. So I think that the most important thing is to have where you can, is to have a strategy that allows you to grow relatively slowly, or at least slowly enough that you can take on enough people that you can maintain the customer satisfaction of all the existing customers and have a marginal customer satisfaction at the same rate. So your new customer comes on board, isn't feeling left out because you're managing your existing ones. So it's trying to make sure that you've got the right levels internally to actually keep the customers that you have. And then obviously, look, if there are disasters that occur and a customer wants to churn because of it or whatever it is, then so be it. That happens, and maybe that's the case. But generally speaking, your response to a disaster will often be the thing that might retain a customer. In fact, and we've also seen that too.
Yeah, I mean, there's always grass looks always greener next door until you get there, and
Yeah,
then you realize, oh my
for sure.
goodness, there's a lot of
Yeah.
weeds. You know what's that thing about
Yes.
you're an IT your company, right? And everything is moving fine. You're getting no problems. Everything is always working. And then the
Hmm.
person says, well, "What am I paying you for?" Right?
That's
Or
it. Yeah.
the worst thing is something does happen, it breaks, and
Yeah.
then the same call. Why am I paying you?
Yeah.
So it's
Wasn't I
damned
paying you
if
to
you
deal
do,
with
damned
this?
yeah.
Yeah.
Damned
Well, I
if you
mean,
do, damned if you don't. Yeah.
but that's an interesting thing. We've all seen, for example, examples recently where the measures that the cybersecurity companies, a lot of MSPs use, where we're talking about companies like Sophos and Huntress and others in the market. There are many. The the best thing that most people can do is for a customer to go through an almost disaster so that they realize just what's going on in the background. And one case that comes up occasionally, and this is quite common, is you get a disaster that happens, like you say, at an inopportune time, midnight,
Mm,
5 in the afternoon, or whatever it is, Super Bowl Sunday. And what happens is your cybersecurity company has essentially, or your MSSP kind of shuts that down and keeps that controlled. You get an alert that this has happened. You send a message to the customer and say to the customer, this is what's going on. Then you go through the kind of post-issue discussion and you say, well, this is what's happened. And then they kind of get back up and running. It's a disaster which doesn't quite happen because we shut things down before things can go wrong. And you can show them what happened, why it happened, how things got how networks got cut off. And that's one of the examples of this is what you pay us for. This
mm.
is because we are here. We have engaged the right people to do this. And essentially that's, where your money is going. It's not just insurance. It's not just kind of, well, we're here to prevent the disaster. We're here to respond to the almost disaster. And where there are some things that really go wrong, we're also here to respond to that. And that's where that idea of a trusted advisor is important. And we've talked about that a lot. But more than that, you've got to be able to trust someone almost as if they worked for your company, as if they cared about your company like they worked for it, rather than as if they were a third party. And that's where I think the MSP value should always be and is always, particularly in the smaller MSP space. And actually, where you see, the big kind of the larger MSPs that kind of scale to extreme sizes, hundreds of millions, billions of dollars, the main thing they have to do to maintain the identity of the MSP is to maintain that same trusted status, which is, well, we trust you as if you worked for our company. And that's, it's obviously harder to do at scale generally. Some do it very well, and they do it, but with essential by keeping kind of federalized model. But that's really what the benefit of the MSP is versus literally anyone else in the industry.
Yeah, I mean, obviously the problems and challenges different depends on the size, right? But even large MSPs, Marks and Spencers got hit, and that had a bit of a churn, right? And these are significant hits, right? And I don't think that those companies are kind of being slack, right? The bad actors just found a way in that all the hundreds of hours was not able
Yeah.
to detect, right? And could have happened to anyone.
Yeah, I mean, M&S was an interesting one because M&S had essentially, as far as I know, and there may be people that would watch this and disagree with my assessment, but I'd seen a few people discuss this and spoke to people about this. The M&S one was a specific one because they'd actually built their own kind of platforms from the ground up. They weren't using a lot of third parties bolted together, but they were building things together. And yes, there were a lot of legacy tech attached to a lot of legacy tech, and yes, they had service providers, for want of a better word, in there, but it wasn't like somebody had full control over the environment and it went wrong. There were lots of gaps in the environment, and there was only so much any one person could do at any one time anyway. The difficulty was, of course, that when you build things in such a way, lateral movement from a threat actor makes it much easier. And that is essentially one of the issues that occurred. And so they were dealing with that for a very long time, and the numbers of loss figures are sort of hearsay, but obviously very high. It's very different for the large MSPs because they're dealing with customers that already have a legacy of tech and a very big one. Taking that on, there is only so much risk that you can realistically assign to yourself. Yes, you have responsibility, but realistically, it's a big sprawling thing, and you won't be the only partner involved in that company, in that deal, in that sector. You will be one of probably six or seven different companies providing services based on data that we have to enterprise environments, and so you don't have oversight on everything. So the challenge that you face there is always is the challenge you face in the small business sector is budgets and sometimes buy-in. The challenge you face in the large sector is, of course, you don't have responsibility, you don't have control over the whole environment. So you have to take kind of the rough with the smooth a little bit. The key thing is that internally at the end customer, that they have teams that are constantly monitoring and feeding back to the service providers they work with, so that when something does happen, things can be, like in the small business environment, can be shut down relatively quickly, and that you can architect things in such a way to make lateral movement much harder.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost the government's, right? Somebody's got to be blamed, and it's not me. It's
Yes, yeah,
it's
definitely that.
that's happening as we speak right now. One of the things that there's a lot of moving parts that we could spend hours talking about
Yeah.
MSPs. The one thing that's kind of interesting is we're hearing this constant tool sprawl. Death by
Hmm.
1,000 tools. I'm just
Mm.
exhausted. I'm
Mm.
spending what roughly a third of my money I'm making with tools. I'm not even sure that these tools are haven't even been updated for a bit. These
Yeah,
tools
yeah,
started being the PSAs and so are a little bit tired now.
yeah, yeah.
They're trying to buy some AI things to kind of glue it a little bit better together, make it better.
Hmm.
Um, are we at a point when somebody's got to figure out how to rip and replace and get something there, or are we just down this rabbit hole too far down, and we've got to keep making the Frankenstein scarier? Where are we headed with tools? It's a big
Well,
question, my friends.
no, no, no. I think no, but it's a fair question, but it's a perennial question because whenever we ask partners around, uh, let's say just in the cyberspace, right? We know that there's thousands of cyber vendors around the world, small and large. Um, and generally speaking, the reason why that occurs is because threats always move on. They always get, they always, there's always a new threat. There's always a new issue. There's always a new vulnerability somewhere. And so there's always venture capital funding ready to uh, fund essentially a new idea around a new issue. And so you probably won't ever get rid of the idea that you will consolidate thousands of cybersecurity companies into 15 is less likely than in sort of hardware areas where things can maybe be a bit more static. Where you do find some kind of interesting is when you ask partners about whether or not they're consolidating, the reason why I mentioned cyber is because many people have many different cyber vendors in their portfolios, and we hear lots of different numbers about exactly how many. But when we ask partners about whether or not they're consolidating the number of cyber vendors they're working with, you would expect that after all of these years, that the number you would get saying yes would be very high. And yet, it's interestingly generally only about 48% of partners at any one time are actually consolidating the number of cyber vendors they're working with. Just over 50% are usually expanding the number of cyber vendors they're working with because they believe that there's something they're missing out there that they're not currently working with. And
There's
maybe what
always
they
a
did was
gap.
they
There's
right,
always a
and maybe
gap.
maybe they'd consolidated a couple of years before, and now they're expanding again. And so there's always a push and a pull with those two things. When it comes to tool sprawl, um, yeah, I mean, the difficulty is I don't think you get rid of tool sprawl. The idea is, do you then decide to throw your hat in with an MSP platform company like an Acronis or a Kaseya or a ConnectWise, and do you decide that they're going to be your primary point of contact? And if you do, are they also going to allow you, have they built integrations with the rest of your tech stack to allow you to manage those bits in a more simplified fashion? Because ultimately, tool sprawl is one thing, because there's always new tools out there. The difficulty is, how do I actually manage those tools? Because if I can't manage those tools in a way that is less complex than it was last year, then the tool sprawl itself just kind of inevitably gets harder. And that's where I think MSPs have to start um, demanding more of some of these platform companies. The difficulty is most of these companies are designing their business around trying to capture as much wallet share from the MSP as possible.
Yep.
That's not useful for the MSP. That's useful for the vendor and its valuations, but frankly, you know, we're all tired of that. What you need is a vendor that says, well, we actually are building integrations with your tech stack. And yes, we have a platform. Yes, we want to sell you RMM and PSA and backup and cyber and all the rest of it. But if you bring other tools into that environment, we will happily help you manage those tools as well. As long as the vendors and some of them do say that, but as long as the vendors aren't saying those kinds of things, and as long as what they're doing is mostly spending their time trying to knit together millions of products they already have into one platform, that's not as useful for the vendor, for the partner, as the company that's saying, "Don't worry, come here. We're agnostic. Yes, we might try and upsell you at some point, but we're not going to be vultures about it. We will send you the opportunity. We'll have a briefing. We'll do a product demo. It's fine. But if you're happy with your current EDR provider, we're not going to try and rip and replace them. Well, but we will help you manage that." And I think we're now getting to a point where those platform companies kind of get that. Difficulty is, do their investors get it? right? Because their investors don't like that kind of thing. Investors tend to want, I want all the money under my umbrella. That's how I get my ROI out of my 8 year private equity kind of investment. That's the difficulty. Is how do those vendors push back against that kind of thing and say, no, what we need is a long-term strategy. We will build value, but we build value by actually playing in a way that enables people to actually get the time saving, cost saving out of that tools brawl with management simplicity. And so that's where I think, MSPs tend to vote with their feet. We've seen that
Mhm.
before. They tend to go, we've had enough of this one. We're going over here. People aren't shy about doing that. So I think as long as they keep doing that, it will keep the vendors on their toes. But yeah, I mean, MSP platforms should be
Mhm.
enabling better simplicity of management of that tools pool.
We will jump into private equity a little bit because well, let's assume they're gonna one day wake up and do the right thing. The reality is that it's complicated. Obviously, everybody wants to tool sprawl is one thing, but then everybody wants lock in because they make the most money.
Yeah.
And then they're down this path of let me buy every single product that an MSP could ever want to use. And even though it's not the best of breed or is best integrated or whatever it is,
Hmm.
it actually makes the others and other innovations from other organizations think
Hmm.
about, well, where do I connect to? And if I connect, am I connecting in a fair play, or am I connecting in a way that just it's a placeholder until the company finds a way to bait and switch the MSP with some
Yeah.
kind of back end game. There's so much things going on. The problem is with lock in as well as these platforms become so large, right? It I believe it becomes even more vulnerable because it's pretty difficult to defend that much than this much. Maybe we
Mm.
really got to extract, if you will, the actual platform, the PSAs, RMNs from the actual tool set so everyone can mix and match the way they want. And maybe that actually at the end becomes more secure because the chance of everybody having the same thing getting hacked at the same time is much greater
Yeah.
than everybody having something different. I'm just using
Yes.
logic here, but what do
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
think about how we need to demand these things?
Yeah. I mean, so that's something that I'd been talking about for a couple of years, which was the idea that um, essentially RMM companies would become management across all of your tech stack. The obvious response to that is, God, no, you don't want that, right? Because you don't want everything in one box. Now, obviously, technologically speaking, there are actually a lot of ways in which it's not really in one box. You can create a lot of kind of walls between those different things. It doesn't stop management, but actually in terms of where the data sits, how you break it up, how you make sure that access to one thing doesn't necessarily give you access to other, and lateral movement, like we were talking about before, can't necessarily happen. You can still have management of, but doesn't necessarily mean you can just move across. Now, the problem is that in order to create an easier to manage environment, let's say the single pane of glass that everyone always talks about, you automatically, if somebody gets admin access to the RMM, and let's say the RMM has access to, everything in that sort of utopian world that people have talked about, then obviously at that point, you know, game's up. But the difficulty, of course, is that then you have essentially identity security on built into the RMM tools, which is as soon as you see anything that creates the sense of anomalous behavior in any way, then immediately, even if someone has access and or has found access, it shuts things down or it sandboxes things or it silos things or whatever it may be to stop that. That does happen, and that is exactly what most companies should be working towards. So whilst I generally agree that yes, I too have the fear that essentially that building the platform essentially builds the worst version of the utopia. If somebody builds it properly, then it's fine. Now, the difficulty is, of course, people tend to build things to be good enough, not great. And that's where, again, as an MSP, you have to be able to audit the technology you're using and making sure that from a cybersecurity perspective, it has got you in mind as the MSP as well as your customers in mind. So, but again, auditing your every single technology you have or auditing all of your platforms in that way and making sure that it has those capabilities built in to secure the platform itself it's easier said than done when if you're a five-person shop and you don't necessarily have the time, there's always issues. Plus that, that technology has to be kept up to date. But
Yeah.
there's a good reason why, like MDR, for example, has been growing so strongly in the MSP space because it gave them finally the ability to be kind of MSSPs of a sort, for their customers, and why things like VGRC or vCISO are so important for end customers because again, they don't necessarily have the ability to build that themselves. So MSPs have to build it for them. And so that's where that ecosystem should come in. It should help those people.
Yeah, and even like you're spot on because I mean, it's a kind of a challenge that where the goalpost keeps moving. You know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
right now, I'm pretty good, but then wait a week and then oh no, it's the goalpost shifted. Imagine playing football or soccer where that keeps moving
Yeah, yeah.
every week or so. Um, I want to jump quickly to the private equity. So
Hmm.
apparently, depending on whose numbers you listen to, about 19-20% of the MSPs are already being rolled up in some kind of a private equity play. Um, so you get these ones that's getting larger and larger. They're amalgamating faster and faster. Um, are we at a point now when I don't know half the MSPs are going to be rolled up in P&Es or is it going to be more independent? What's your thoughts? What's happening out there?
I mean, the short answer is yes. I think there's definitely a lot of acquisition to come. Because well, I think that so let's say we take some of the kind of the larger names in the market. Think about kind of companies like Evergreen, for example, and then they have a few other peers in the US which are building at that kind of billion-dollar level. Um, the I think that the most interesting thing is when you look at not necessarily the North America acquisitions, but how they've expanded globally. A lot of their expansion has been in places like the UK and Australia for language reasons. It makes a lot of sense to expand from North America and out. There are a lot of small managed service providers, consultancies, companies essentially that fit within the small and medium-sized business sector, which could be acquired because they have great capabilities. And I think that there's obviously more headroom for that to occur, and so that will continue to be the case. Now, there's two things which are kind of interesting about the private equity investment. One is that not all private equity companies are kind of built the same. Some of them have a kind of slow build, careful, federated model where essentially different. They realize that the MSP is essentially always going to be a local player. What they want to do is try to enable those MSPs to maybe expand those geographical horizons a bit, invest in the MSP, essentially get more market share in their local areas. And then essentially what you've got is a series of kind of influence circles of MSP across the country, across a region. And I think there's a lot more of that sort of potentially to happen. And we see that in the Netherlands too, in the UK and France and so on. There's small, private equity companies and VCs sort of trying to build that kind of thing. So I think there is more space to do that. However, two things do occur. One is, of course, that there's always, as there are new technologies, therefore there are going to be new MSPs sprout up to manage those technologies, and there'll be new consultancies that specialize in those things. The other thing is that with those private equity companies that are essentially looking at their acquisitions in the MSP space and saying, right, how do I AI 20% of that? And how do I get rid of 20% of that headcount so that I can extract 20% more money? There's a lot of people doing that right now. And what that means is, unfortunately, a lot of people losing positions who had been at MSPs before. And that will also mean new consultancies and MSPs being created on the back end. Not every one of those people that leaves based on the kind of AI replacement will start an MSP, but the difficulty is, of course, that the job market is so difficult at the moment because we've seen vendor cuts, we've seen partner cuts, we've seen MSP cuts. There's kind of cuts everywhere. Um, that it's not like, well, if I lose my job at the MSP, I could just go to internal IT, or I can just go to the vendor, or I can just, unfortunately, everyone's kind of cutting back, and AI is one of the narratives around that. But it will also potentially create new consultancies and MSPs to go to market. And those new specialists will be people that know how an MSP is meant to be built. They will try to build it in a way that maybe minimizes some of that burnout culture we talked about before, maybe understands things like compliance, maybe understands things like, which customers need real service maybe they weren't getting at the previous MSP and so on, as we've seen that before. So there's a few different factors playing into private equity's rolling up of the MSP space. Not all PE companies are the same. Some do it differently. There's a lot more headroom to be done, particularly in the non-English speaking kind of countries around Europe, Asia Pacific, Latin America, Africa, Middle East. There's a lot of MSPs there that essentially, wouldn't mind necessarily being part of a group because
Mm.
actually it might make the strengths. It's just that we focus mostly on North America and kind of Western media. And so we sort of look at that and say, well, surely consolidation's already happened, but actually, we're a long way from that point.
The masses that haven't. And by the way, we are seeing tons of new pop-ups, right? From
Mm.
people exactly as
Yep.
you said, right? That
Yep.
we would say, "Hey, did I know you? Didn't you work at that MSP? Yeah, they let me go, man, or I left, whatever." And but
Yep.
guess what, man? I took 10 of their customers. And I'm
Yep.
going, aren't you gonna get sued for that? Yeah, come after me, man. It's like, let's roll. No one really cares anymore. Um,
True.
and I think you and I both know that the blueprint, right, for an MSP
Mhm.
is so well documented now. You can almost, I don't know, you could probably chat GBT it, right? Like,
You absolutely can.
how
Yeah,
do you make a
yeah. I've
best?
seen it. I've seen it being done.
I know, and it's not a secret anymore, right? And the
Mm.
tools are actually getting better. AI is helping them to do it even faster
Yeah.
and so on. So if you got a little bit of a skill set, it's not that crazy to spin it up. My last question here, and by the way, man, we could talk for hours. This is probably just part one of something, right? But um, so AI is just there, right? And
Yeah.
from my end, we all see all the millions of people talk about left and right of AI, whatever is going on. But
Mhm.
we're actually seeing some really great results starting, even though some data was showing that not everybody is, making money with. There's no ROI in AI, and I just think that's a lot of BS.
Mhm.
Because if you look down at the business level, people are actually using AI to reduce the amount of working hours.
Yeah.
They're spending, even if they're working longer hours, they're definitely outputting a lot more. And it just seems like AI is going to help a lot in ticketing. It's going to help to reduce those number of tickets that's coming up. It's going to help them to find information faster, better, quicker, et cetera, et cetera. Maybe generate those QBR reports much
Yeah.
easier, even if they don't probably read what's inside.
Well, yeah,
there are a
that's
lot.
another problem.
I'm just going to leave it there. But the reality is that there's a lot of ways AI could help them. What are you seeing in how MSPs are adopting AI for themselves internally? And my part two question, which may be a little crazier, how are they having a seat at the table in the AI for their customers? Because I kind of
Mm.
feel if they're not at that AI seat, they're gonna kind of left out a bit in the cold. So AI
Yeah.
in their business and AI at their customer level.
Yeah. So, I mean, you mentioned the use cases, kind of the ones that everyone looked at, the things that were automatable based on the fact that they were essentially repeated. So there's that old kind of Google mantra. If you do something twice, automate it.
Yeah.
The idea is essentially where you can see things that are repeated, you can automate them. And in ticketing, uh, there are different numbers of majorities, but essentially at least a majority, and in some cases up to sort of 80% and maybe even more of tickets are relatively low level things like password resets and so on.
Yeah.
And so in those environments where you have something can be more deterministic, i.e., this when you look at essentially a simple rule, it's not so much AI as it is automation. It's basic kind of, if then type stuff. But automation, it doesn't matter whether it's AI, automation, or a mix of the two. What you're looking at is essentially, did it make the process faster? Did it make the process at least as reliable or more reliable? And then after that, if it did do those things, well, then you can look at, well, what's the relevance? What did it do for me? And the idea of ROI is essentially, well, let's say we talked about this retention thing earlier, and I have seen this, and I've actually seen is very interesting. I've actually seen VC companies talking about this too. So not always, am I cynical about where there's kind of money people and what their motivations are? VC companies investing in AI, sometimes, some of them, certainly in Europe, are looking at that and saying exactly this kind of thing around MSP, which is if I can automate, let's say, 20% of a general L1, L2, L3 tech time as an amount in a year. If I can automate 20% of that overall time, then I can probably minimize the number of people who have got five or maybe even 10 years or even longer in my MSP from leaving. The worst thing that the last thing you want to do is to lose someone who's not only got skills but understands your business and understands your customers. What you really want to do is you want to make them less stressed. That generally means that they are one, able to maximize their value to you, essentially as somebody who understands your business and knows where essentially where all the nuts and bolts are. But they also know your customers and they're often trusted. And as you talked about, somebody leaves and maybe they take some customers with them. There's a reason why they can do that because they're the people on the front lines. Now, it's very interesting when you start to see the money people understand that kind of thing because we're
Mm.
now at that phase where those people do get it. There are PE companies and VC companies. They understand MSP real well and they understand where the real problems are. And they know that that's where our ROI can come in is things like retention, time saving, and so on. When it comes to doing it for the customers, one of the big issues is, as we have seen, is you can secure your business, for example. You can put AI into your business. Learning how to create a short form sales conversation around the value that that delivered is another question. And then what you've got to do is realize, well, what am I actually going in and telling the customer? How am I going to do that for them? And then can I extract that into a professional service, consulting gig, project, whatever it might be? Now, let's say you're a small MSP and you have 20 customers. You're a small company, but you've built some automations inside your company, and actually you've got a little bit of kind of AI ticket triage going on. And you got it at a really good level, and maybe you went in with, Zofig that got acquired by ConnectWise recently, or maybe you went in with some of the other sort of AI service desk companies that are built up of a similar size. And what you did was you essentially saved some time, automated some process, and made things a bit easier, automated some workflows, and maybe you're using Roost and some others to help you do that. If you are at that level where you're using those kinds of things, even if you're a small company, because there are some small companies that use Roost too, even though Roost is, it's got great capabilities, there are some small ones that use it. And so what's very interesting is if you can transmit the benefits that you felt from that to your customers in some way, then you can. But it's not necessarily that customers aren't demanding it. It's just you don't necessarily know how to go and talk to them about it. But usually, essentially, it's a project thing rather than necessarily a recurring revenue, maybe.
Mm.
But what you can do is you can explain to your customers the benefit of what you've done to them of the AI, which is essentially things like mean time to response, mean time to detection. These are where kind of AI help MSPs to improve their SLAs essentially with their customers. That is taking it out to your customers in one form or another. It's just that you've done it internally, but the benefit has also been felt externally. So what we want to do is try to realize that maybe the lines aren't quite so stark between internal and external. Maybe that there's a lot of overlap too. The question is just how you transmit that messaging to your customers. And that's, again, that's perhaps another skill to be seen. But I mean, there's some really very cool and very advanced stuff being done right now when it comes to uh, essentially AI that learns the data of the MSP and how it can improve the everyday function of the MSP from a cybersecurity perspective, compliance perspective, help the customers with it too. It's going to be very interesting to go where that's going to go in the future. Obviously, not everyone will do that. Not everyone will move at the same pace, and obviously we don't want to believe too much hype as well. But there's a lot of great things to happen in the future. The key thing is just I think we have to realize what ROI really means and just be a little bit more flexible around sort of defining that term.
Yeah. I mean, there's companies like Pia and
Yeah.
Synchronous who's kind of leveraging a lot of AI to kind of help solve, big problems and reducing that workload. And I think the key here is like in the airplane is safe, we need oxygen, put on your mask first. Like
Mm, yeah,
you gotta do your own AI first to
yeah,
kind of feel, the impact before you help others with AI. But I think the message there is that they better get there faster because their customers have already pressed that button, that AI button, and I'm not even sure they know what they're doing with AI. And of
yeah.
course, you and I both know it opens up lots of cyber risks and IP problems and yada yada yada. So it's almost like we've got another wave, if you will, of complexities by trying to
Yeah.
tame that, right?
Well, the one thing I would say, just to end, is with agentic AI, people need to see agentic AI as essentially a person with an identity and access. So an agent is a distinct thing that has access to your data. And so when you think about it in that way, the idea you can say, well, agentic AI will just do this. Okay, but now imagine that you just gave someone admin access to every part of your company. Think about agents in that way. Think about them as that kind of a risk, and then think about them as imagine them as nefarious actors that have access to everything right from the start, and then go back from there to what you actually want them to do, and think about them in that way as cyber risks.
Good point. I just worry when AI agents start to create their own AI agents, then their
Hmm.
AI agents create their own AI agents. That little
Yeah.
thing, and then we have no clue who. Can you imagine a really bad AI agent figuring out how to create their own AI agents? Oh my god, we could go down this rabbit hole. Robin, it's been an absolute
Yes.
pleasure, my friend. Let's keep in touch and keep bringing this information. I think this is information that channel partners need to digest and understand how to play this game. It's a lot of moving parts, man. And how do you got to, one bite at a time, if you will, to digest this stuff. And the ones who can get there faster is going to win. Anything you want to wrap up with in your side that's happening at your company?
Yeah, well, I mean, look, I mean, I think that one thing I'd say is I always enjoy talking with you, and we've talked before, and I always really enjoy having these discussions because it gives me an opportunity to kind of level set all the conversations I'm having with partners. The one thing I'd say is just, as much as growth may be hard for some people to achieve this year, and maybe the gap between the ones that are growing and the ones that are struggling maybe gets a little bit wider this year. I also think that y- where you where you are best served right now as MSPs is try not to listen too much to, all of the talking heads, myself included. I mean, the difficulty is what I'd say is what when people have your best interests at heart as an MSP, take your time, understand that, MSP is a great collaborative environment to be in. Yes, it's getting harder. Yes, it's getting riskier. But your other fellow MSPs are still out there, and they're all there to share information and talk with one another. I think that's the best part of the industry we work in, and it's one of the reasons why I love working in this area because it's so personal to people. So I think, whatever data is out there, whatever we put out there, if you have questions, ask, be like, well, what does this relate to and where does the data come from? But the main thing I would say is just as long as the community is still there to protect the community itself, I think, growth will come and growth will go, right? But be out there talking to your peers, get the information. If you have a struggle, don't worry too much about, what everyone's shouting and screaming about AI and the fires and so on. You know, get into your kind of tech tribe environments, go to your local community meetings, talk to those environments, and then, you will find a way through all this. I think that's the most important thing about the MSP community right now. People gotta work together. Yes, times are volatile, but the good people are still out there.
100%, Robin. Is it actually the one thing I always tell MSPs? If you never hear anything I say for the years and just do one thing and one thing only, get together with a peer group,
Yeah.
find seven other buddies or whatever. I don't care what the number is. Hang out, share
Yeah.
your pain, share some beers, have a few pints, and
Mm.
believe it, everybody has the same problems. It's just no
Yes.
one wants to tell you first, right? But once you start sharing and everybody within that group is able to do it, you can find all the answers. I mean, it's not rocket science. And if you really, lean and collaborate with a small group, I'm not talking about a large community, it's where you can find your own space to talk about your problems. You're not embarrassed and you don't feel you're sharing too much, and all that stuff. So a peer group is definitely the way to go. And let's keep this ball rolling, man. It's incredible information we need to share. Thank you.
Thanks, man. Look forward to it. Bye.
Cheers. Bye.